Mallory Quinn stepped out of her white Mercedes and let her gaze travel slowly across the rusted sign above the garage door. Whitaker Auto Works, the letters flaking in the gray Ohio afternoon. And then she laughed. Not quietly, not to herself, but openly, in the direction of her 10-year-old son standing beside her, as if the laughter itself were a lesson she was trying to teach him. 5 years had passed since she left Cade Whitaker. 5 years since she decided that a man who chose a grease-stained apron over a corner office was a man who had chosen failure. And standing here now, with rain beginning to spot the asphalt and the old shop sign rattling in the wind like something that had already given up, she felt entirely confirmed. She had no way of knowing that behind the peeling walls of that building sat blueprints worth more than anything she had ever touched. And she had no way of knowing that the name she was laughing at was about to appear on a Forbes list that would silence every room she walked into for the rest of her life. Stay with this story until the end, because the secret inside that old garage is about to make every word of mockery cost exactly what it deserved. The rain arrived in Ashford, Ohio, the way it always did in late October, sideways, cold, carrying the smell of rust and wet concrete from the overpass half a mile north. Whitaker Auto Works sat where it had always sat, wedged between a closed bait shop and a gravel lot that nobody had developed in 15 years, its corrugated steel roof orange with age, its single bay door rolled halfway up so the afternoon gray could filter in over the hydraulic lift. Cade Whitaker was on his back beneath a Ford F-150. His left hand wrapped around a socket wrench, his right arm navigating the undercarriage by feel alone. He had been at it since 6 that morning, and he would be at it, if everything held, until Nolan needed dinner. His jeans carried 3 different kinds of oil. His gray thermal shirt had a tear at the left shoulder he had never gotten around to fixing. From the outside, from any outside, he looked like precisely what Mallory Quinn had always told people he was, a man who had stopped growing. He heard the Mercedes before he saw it. The engine was clean, recent, expensive in a way that announced itself. He didn't slide out from beneath the truck immediately. He finished the bolt he was working on, gave it a final quarter turn, and only then pushed himself out onto the concrete floor and stood up. Mallory was already walking toward him, her heels picking their way across the cracked lot with the careful, deliberate precision of someone who did not want to get dirty and also wanted you to notice that she did not want to get dirty. She wore a cream-colored coat he didn't recognize, her dark hair pulled back, a canvas bag over one arm that probably cost more than the parts invoice pinned to the wall behind him. Sterling Vaughn, her fiancé, had not come today. Just her and Nolan, which meant this was a pickup, not an ambush, at least not yet. Nolan came first. He always came first, crossing the lot at a near run, ducking under his father's arm, and pressing his face against Cade's ribs in the way that 10-year-old boys allow themselves to do in private but rarely in public, and Cade held him for a moment with his cleaner hand, the one that only had grease in the creases. "Hey, bud," he said. That was all. Nolan pulled back and looked up at his father with the specific expression he had been perfecting lately. A combination of pride and worry, as if he had already begun to understand that the world was not being fair about something and had not yet decided whether to be angry about that or simply patient. Mallory stopped a few feet away, looked at the hydraulic lift, at the row of mismatched tires propped against the far wall, at the cluttered pegboard hung with wrenches arranged in an order only Cade understood, and she let out a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a laugh but carried the DNA of both. 5 years, she said, as if the number itself were a verdict, and it's exactly the same. Cade wiped his hands on the shop rag hanging from his pocket. He didn't answer right away, because he had learned, slowly, through a great deal of effort, that not every observation required a response. She filled the silence herself, the way she always had. She said that Nolan needed stability. She said that growing up around unpaid invoices and engine parts was not a childhood, it was a waiting room. She said that she was only telling him what anyone who cared about that boy could see plainly. Cade looked at his son, then back at Mallory, and said what he always said when she pushed in this particular direction. Nothing cruel, nothing defensive, just the flat truth as he understood it. He told Nolan to grab his bag from the office and make sure he had his math book. Then he looked at Mallory and said, quietly, that not everyone needed to understand what you were building while you were building it. She stared at him. He could see she wanted to find something dismissive to do with that sentence, and after a moment she found it. She smiled, the particular smile that meant she considered the statement proof of exactly what she'd always thought. A man nearly 40 years old, she said, still talking about building things in a garage that smelled like motor oil and old receipts. She glanced one final time at the sign above the bay door. She told him that sooner or later, the bank would take it. Then she called to Nolan, turned on her heel, and walked back to the car. After the Mercedes pulled out onto the highway and its taillights disappeared into the drizzle, Cade stood in the open bay for a moment without moving. Then he walked to the main door, pulled down the overhead, and slid the deadbolt. He crossed the shop to the far wall, the one hung with the largest of the pegboards, the one where 3 generations of mechanics had stored their tools, and he reached behind a section of board near the corner. There was a panel there, disguised well enough that nobody who hadn't been shown it would think to look. It swung inward. Beyond it was a room that had no business existing inside a building that looked like this one. 2 wide monitors casting blue light across a pair of drafting tables, a whiteboard covered in notation, a compact server rack humming against the back wall, and stacked beside the door, carefully organized in labeled folders, a set of contracts bearing the letterheads of 3 of the largest commercial transportation companies operating in the United States. The life Cade Whitaker had lived before the shop was not a secret. It was simply a story nobody in Ashford had bothered to ask about after a certain point, because the shop itself became the whole of what they thought they knew. He had graduated with honors in mechanical engineering from Ohio State, had been recruited directly into the R&D division of a company building early commercial electric trucks, and had spent 3 years there doing work that his supervisor described in one annual review as the kind of thinking that comes around once a decade. He had believed in what the company was doing. He had believed in it enough to marry Mallory in the spring of his 3rd year there, when everything felt like it was accelerating in the right direction. Then he found the datasets. It happened on a Tuesday in late February. He had been cross-referencing internal safety performance logs against the figures submitted to federal certification bodies, and the numbers didn't match, not by a small margin. The discrepancy was systematic, deliberate, and large enough to constitute a significant risk to any driver operating the vehicles at highway load. He documented everything over the following week, said nothing to anyone except his department head, and waited. The department head thanked him, told him the compliance team would look into it, and 2 weeks later called him into a meeting where 3 people he had never seen before sat across a table and explained that his concerns had been reviewed, found to lack technical merit, and that he was being placed on a 60-day performance improvement plan. He resigned the following morning. He cleared his desk without ceremony, drove home to the apartment where Mallory was waiting, and told her what he had done and why he had done it. She heard him out. She was quiet for a long time after he finished. Then she asked him what the plan was. He told her he had an idea, that he had been thinking about a problem in heavy-load drive systems for years, that he wanted to pursue it independently, that he had enough savings to buy an existing repair operation and use it as a base while he worked. He said he thought he could build something real. She asked him if something real paid their mortgage. He said not immediately. She asked him what immediately meant. He said he didn't know exactly. She nodded slowly in the way that people nod when they have already made a decision and are only waiting for a decent interval to pass before announcing it. The divorce was filed 14 months later. By then, Cade had already purchased the Ashford shop from a retired mechanic named Dwight Calloway, who was moving to Florida, had installed the hidden research room himself over the course of 3 weekends, and had reached out to Vaughn Mercer, a patent attorney he had known since college, who was then running his own practice out of Columbus. Mallory took the apartment, the joint savings account, and the newer of their 2 vehicles, all of which Cade agreed to without negotiation. She left him the shop because she was certain it was worth nothing. He was certain of precisely the same thing, and for entirely different reasons. When he signed the final papers, she was already standing near the elevator with her lawyer, already inhabiting the future she had chosen, and Cade held the key to the shop in his right hand and thought about the word Vaughn had used when Cade had first walked him through the conceptual framework of what he was developing. Vaughn had listened for 40 minutes without interrupting, and then he had looked up from the notes he'd been taking and said, simply, "Cade, this is generational." The custody agreement gave them equal time with Nolan. Cade asked for nothing more, because what he needed most in the months that followed was not sympathy or vindication but quiet. The specific operational quiet of a man who understands that the work itself is the only argument that matters. The system Cade developed over the following years was called the W-cell drive. At its core, it was a hybrid transmission architecture that integrated regenerative battery storage with a compact hydrogen fuel cell, managed by a proprietary load distribution algorithm that Cade had spent roughly 4,000 hours refining across 3 complete redesigns. The effect, when the system was installed in a standard Class 8 heavy truck, was a 41% reduction in fuel cost over long-haul routes, a significant decrease in brake wear, and an emissions profile that existing electric alternatives could not match at equivalent payload. Cade had not invented any single component of the system. What he had invented was the way they spoke to each other, the logic that sat between them, interpreting conditions and distributing demand in real time, in a way that existing approaches had not managed. Vaughn Mercer filed the first cluster of patents during the 2nd year of development, using a holding entity they named Whittaker Dynamics, a name that appeared nowhere in connection with the Ashford shop, nowhere on any public registry, and nowhere that the large manufacturers and investment funds circling the clean transport sector would have any reason to connect to a single father in a grease-stained thermal shirt. That distance was intentional. Cade had watched what happened to independent inventors who surfaced too early, and he had no interest in being acquired for 20 cents on the dollar before the technology had been proven at scale. He wanted test data. He wanted contract language that protected him. He wanted, as he told Vaughn one night over coffee in the research room while rain hammered the roof overhead, to be the kind of person who could say no to a bad deal because he had already built something good enough to wait. The pilot programs began quietly. 2 regional freight operators, introduced through a logistics consultant Vaughn trusted, agreed to trial the W-cell drive in a combined fleet of 11 trucks over an 18-month period. The fuel savings were documented. The maintenance data was collected. The results were submitted to a third-party engineering firm for independent review, and the review came back in language that Vaughn read twice before calling Cade at 11:30 on a Wednesday night to read it aloud. By the time Cade sat across from his first serious investors, a small group of infrastructure-focused funds who had heard about the technology through channels that Vaughn had carefully managed, the company had no marketing deck, no flashy presentation, and no offices. It had data, it had patents, it had the kind of numbers that make people in rooms like that very quiet and very attentive. Vaughn told Cade during a late meeting in the research room that the most recent third-party valuation had crossed $8 billion. The number sat in the air between them for a moment. Cade looked at the whiteboard, looked at the folders on the shelf, looked at the coffee cup he'd been refilling since 9 that evening. Then he said he wanted to keep things tight for a while longer. He had one reason that was strategic, and one reason he didn't name out loud, which was that Nolan was 10 years old, and the boy deserved the chance to learn who his father was before the rest of the world decided it had an opinion. In the meantime, Sterling Vaughn had begun making his presence felt in Nolan's life in the way that men like Sterling always did, through the accumulation of visible things. The new house outside Columbus had a pool and a dedicated study and a car service for school pickup, and Mallory had begun talking to Cade in the slow, patient tone of someone building a legal argument, suggesting that Nolan's long-term interests might be better served by a revised custody arrangement. It was Sterling who had shaped that suggestion. It was Sterling who had spoken privately with a family law attorney and identified the particular language most likely to succeed. And it was Sterling who had looked at the shop in Ashford and seen, with complete confidence, something too small to worry about. The letter from Reagan Holloway at Forbes arrived on a Thursday. It was professional, brief, and somehow already more thoroughly informed than Cade had expected. Holloway had identified the patents, had traced the structure of Whittaker Dynamics far enough to confirm Cade's role as founder and primary inventor, and had cross-referenced the pilot program data with public transportation industry filings in a way that suggested she had been working this story for several months. She asked for a conversation. Cade read the letter twice, set it on the desk, and called Vaughn. Vaughn said what he had been saying for 6 months. The identity was going to surface regardless, and a single well-told story from a credible source was worth 10 times the damage control it would take to respond to a dozen poorly told ones. Cade said he needed a few days. Vaughn said fine, but not more than a week. Cade agreed to the interview. They arrived on a gray Tuesday morning. Mallory's white Mercedes, Sterling's charcoal SUV following close behind, the two vehicles pulling into the gravel lot with the unified purpose of people who have rehearsed the conversation they're about to have. Sterling Vaughn was the kind of man who dressed for leverage, a dark wool blazer over a pressed shirt, no tie, the specific casual that cost more than formal. He stepped out of his vehicle and looked at the shop the way he might look at a restaurant with no reviews. Not hostile, not curious, just dismissive, with a base-level certainty that nothing interesting had ever happened here, and nothing interesting was about to. Mallory was already crossing the lot, her expression carrying the particular tightness of someone who has prepared what they're going to say and is managing the urge to start before the right moment. Nolan had come in the back seat of the Mercedes, and when he climbed out and saw the shop, his face did what it always did in this specific place. It settled. The tension that he carried in his shoulders from school and from the Columbus house and from the waiting rooms of mediators smoothed out, and he walked toward his father with the unhurried confidence of a child arriving somewhere he belongs. Cade met him at the bay door, crouched briefly to his level, said something quiet. Nolan nodded and went inside. Sterling entered the shop without being invited and began the kind of slow survey that people conduct when they want you to know they're taking inventory. He looked at the lift. He looked at the parts shelves. He looked at the coffee maker that had been there since Dwight Calloway owned the place. Its carafe, a permanent shade of amber. Then he turned to Cade and asked, in the tone of a man performing a public service, whether Cade had ever considered pursuing work in a more structured professional environment. He said he had contacts in the fleet management sector. If Cade was open to a conversation. Mallory stood slightly behind him, arms folded against the cold that still clung to her coat, and said nothing. Cade said he was fine where he was. Sterling glanced around once more, nodded slowly, and then said the thing he had prepared in advance, the one designed to close the room. He said that ambition was a muscle, and like any muscle, it atrophied when you stopped using it. Mallory didn't flinch at that. She had heard Sterling talk like this enough that it no longer sounded calculated. It sounded like oxygen to her. She added her own layer then, telling Cade about the new house's study, the tutoring program Nolan had been enrolled in, the private school tour they'd already completed. She wasn't cruel about it. She was precise, which was worse. She was describing a future so complete that Cade's version of one simply ceased to exist alongside it. Then Sterling noticed the paper on the drafting table. He had drifted in that direction the way people drift toward things they don't intend to examine, casually, without appearing to move, and his eyes caught a section of the top sheet before Cade stepped across and turned it face down with one hand. It was a partial schematic, 3 symbols in a notation that Sterling had encountered once before in a technical brief that had crossed his desk. A brief about a proprietary drive system that his fund had spent 6 months trying to identify the source of. Sterling looked at Cade's hand on the paper. He looked at Cade's face. Something that might have been recognition passed through his expression and was immediately replaced by the practiced neutrality of a man who doesn't want to show what he's just understood. He said nothing. He tucked the moment away. The document Sterling had brought was a 2-page agreement, printed on his fund's letterhead, requesting a modification to the existing custody arrangement in language that was civil and legally careful and unmistakably designed to reduce Cade's custodial role to something ceremonial. Sterling set it on the workbench with his fingers spread on top of it, as if he were presenting evidence. He told Cade that this wasn't about taking anything from him. It was about giving Nolan what he deserved. Cade looked at the document for a long time without touching it. Then he said that what Nolan deserved was a father who hadn't traded his backbone for a house with a pool. The silence after that was the kind that has weight to it. Mallory opened her mouth and then closed it. Sterling straightened up, and outside, a black SUV pulled slowly into the gravel lot and stopped. Reagan Holloway stepped out of the passenger side of the SUV with the composed efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough to know that entrances matter. She was in her early 40s in a charcoal blazer, and she carried a leather portfolio under one arm. Behind her came 2 people Cade recognized. A senior attorney from the patent firm in Columbus that Vaughn had partnered with, and a representative from one of the 3 transportation companies whose contract letterheads sat in the folders on the research room shelf. Vaughn Mercer came last, climbing out of the driver's side with the unhurried confidence of a man who has reviewed all the paperwork and has no outstanding concerns. Reagan crossed the lot and stepped into the shop doorway. She looked at Cade, looked briefly at Mallory and Sterling without acknowledging them, and then said, with the directness of someone whose time costs something, "Mr. Whitaker, thank you for agreeing to this. Congratulations also on the Meridian contract." She used his name and the company name together, Whitaker, founder of Whitaker Dynamics, and the 6 syllables hit the air in that shop like a structural change. Mallory's chin came up. Sterling went very still. Vaughn set a folder on the workbench beside Sterling's custody document. He didn't make a ceremony of it. He simply placed it there and stepped back. Inside were the filings that confirmed everything Reagan had already told Cade she knew. The patent cluster, the corporate structure, the third-party valuation, and the signed contracts representing the first commercial rollout of the WCell drive system across a combined heavy fleet of over 300 vehicles. The valuation on the cover page was $24 billion, and Cade's ownership stake sat at a number that put him, as of that morning's publication confirmation, in the top 10 self-made billionaires named in Forbes that quarter. Sterling Vaughn picked up the folder. He set it back down. He picked it up again. Mallory watched his face move through several expressions without settling on one. She said, in a very small voice, that she didn't understand. Reagan Holloway said, with professional neutrality, that Mr. Whitaker had founded and built Whitaker Dynamics over a period of roughly 7 years, primarily from the research facility behind this building, and that the company's first major commercial contracts had been signed in the preceding 6 months. She said that the story Forbes was publishing focused on exactly this, on the fact that one of the most significant developments in clean commercial transportation technology in the past decade had come not from a well-capitalized Silicon Valley startup, but from a single-income household in a working-class Ohio town. Sterling turned to Cade. The expression on his face was not quite embarrassment and not quite anger. It was something more specific and harder to look at. The expression of a man who has built his identity around identifying value and has just discovered he missed something fundamental. He said, tightly, that he had no idea. Cade said, without unkindness, that he was aware of that. Sterling said that the fund he managed had been tracking Whitaker Dynamics for nearly a year. Cade said he knew that too. Sterling's jaw worked once, quietly, as the second thing he had missed became apparent. Nolan came out from the back of the shop holding a bottle of water he'd poured himself from the cooler. He stopped in the doorway, read the room with the quick, accurate radar that children develop when they have spent time in spaces full of adult tension, and then walked to his father's side. He didn't ask what was happening. He looked at all the strangers, looked at the folder on the workbench, looked at his mother's face, and then looked up at Cade and asked whether they were still going to fix his bike this weekend. Cade put his hand on his son's shoulder. He said yes, they were absolutely still going to fix the bike. Reagan Holloway, who had been in this business long enough to know a story's real center when she saw it, made a note. After Reagan's team left to finalize the article's details, and the attorneys finished their paperwork, the 4 of them remained in the shop. Cade, Mallory, Sterling, and the particular quality of silence that follows a radical revision of reality. Sterling recovered first, because men like Sterling recover from embarrassment by immediately converting it into opportunity. He straightened his jacket. He said that given what he now knew, he would like to propose a different kind of conversation. That his fund was well positioned to accelerate the global expansion of Whitaker Dynamics, and that given Cade's obvious need for institutional support at scale, a structured investment arrangement would be mutually beneficial. He said this looking Cade in the eye with the specific sincerity of someone whose sincerity is always in service of something. Cade said no. He said it without explanation, without apology, and without the slightest indication that the answer might be revisited. Sterling pressed the way he always pressed, listing resources, naming contacts, framing the refusal as a failure of strategic imagination. Cade listened to the list and then said something that Vaughn Mercer, who had stepped back into the shop behind them, would later describe as the most efficiently honest thing he had heard a client say in 22 years of practice. He said that Sterling's fund had made 2 approaches to a former engineer who had worked on an early W-cell prototype, seeking proprietary technical data without authorization, and that both approaches were documented. He said that Vaughn had the documentation and that it would be handled through the appropriate legal channels, and that he wished Sterling a productive afternoon. Sterling's composure left him the way color leaves a face, quickly and completely. He turned to Mallory as if she owed him a response to this, and Mallory looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and what she saw in that moment was something she had been not quite seeing for a long time. That the man she had chosen as a replacement for the life she'd left behind was not more ambitious than Cade, or more successful, or more assured. He was simply louder about it. She had confused noise for substance, and standing in this shop, the shop she had spent years treating as evidence of someone else's failure, She felt the specific discomfort of a person who has just understood that the measuring stick they've been using was wrong. Von Mercer stepped forward and handed Sterling a business card. He said that any communication going forward regarding the matters he'd referenced should be directed to his office. Sterling took the card. He looked at it. He put it in his breast pocket with the practiced calm of a man who has been handed bad news in rooms before, turned without speaking, and walked out to the parking lot. The gravel crunched under his shoes. His SUV door closed. The engine turned over, and then he was gone. Mallory didn't move. She stood in the same spot she'd been standing when Reagan Holloway had said Cade's name, and she looked at the workbench, at the folder still lying there, at the corrugated walls of the shop that she had been walking past for years without once wondering what they contained. Cade didn't press her. He had learned, across years of being pressed himself, the difference between giving someone space to think and abandoning them in a difficult moment, and he stood at an angle to her, neither facing her nor turned away, and let the silence do what silence can do when it's allowed to. She said, finally, that she had always known he was smart. She said it carefully, as if she were testing whether the sentence would hold weight. Cade didn't fill it. She said that when they were married, she had believed the smartness would eventually produce something she could point to, and when it hadn't produced anything she recognized, she had decided the smartness itself was a kind of failure. She said she knew that wasn't fair. He told her it was honest, at least. She said that was the kindest thing he could have said, and she meant it. He could see that she meant it. He said that her honesty had never been the problem. He paused. He said that what had stayed with him, what he had spent a long time working through, wasn't the divorce or the settlement or even the years of her treating the shop like a punchline. It was the morning she had laughed at this place in front of Nolan, not at Cade, but in front of his son, as if the boy should be embarrassed by where his father worked. That, he said, was what had taken time. Mallory didn't argue the point. She looked at the floor. Cade told her that he was not carrying it as a grievance, that he understood she had been operating from a picture of success that she'd been handed long before she met him, and that pictures like that are hard to see past. He said what he needed from her now was not an apology to him, but a commitment to Nolan, that their son would never again be made to feel that the work of his hands or the simplicity of his life was something to hide. Mallory said she understood. She said she could do that. She said it in the voice of someone making a promise that costs them something, which is the only kind of promise worth making. The Forbes piece ran on a Thursday morning under a headline that moved through the industry at the speed that headlines move when they connect something people had been half sensing to something they can finally see. From rusted garage to clean energy empire, Cade Whitaker enters the top 10 self-made billionaires. Within 6 hours, the wire services had picked it up. By early afternoon, a regional television crew was parked in the gravel lot outside Whitaker Auto Works, and 2 more were on their way from Columbus. Ashford, Ohio had the particular experience of a small town that has been holding a story it didn't know it was holding. The hardware store owner on Main remembered Cade coming in for electrical supplies on a Saturday 2 winters ago and buying 3 times more than you'd need for any repair job. The woman who ran the diner a quarter mile from the shop recalled that he always ordered the same thing and always paid cash and always left with his head down, and she had figured he was embarrassed by something. The county commissioner, who had once suggested in a public meeting that the stretch of highway frontage where the shop sat was underutilized and might be better repurposed, experienced a full morning of calls from constituents who felt that he should reflect carefully on the meaning of the word underutilized. The article itself was 6,000 words, and Reagan Holloway had written it with the care of someone who understood that the story she was telling was not really about technology or money, even though it was technically about both. It traced Cade's original departure from the electric vehicle company without naming the fraudulent data specifically. Legal reasons, Vaughn had explained, though the implication was clear to anyone reading carefully. It described the years in the shop in language that was precise about the conditions without being romantic about them. The early mornings, the research sessions that ran past midnight, the period when the shop's legitimate repair revenue barely covered the materials budget for the W-Cell drive prototypes. The months when Cade had taken on a second set of clients 2 counties over just to keep the math working. It named the patients, repeatedly, as the engine of the whole enterprise. Reagan had asked Cade during the interview what the hardest part had been, and he had said, without hesitating, that the hardest part was being certain enough in what he was building to withstand everyone who was certain it was nothing. She had used the line, with his permission, as the article's kicker. Mallory read the piece on her phone at the kitchen island in Sterling's Columbus house, and she read it twice. The second time she looked at the photograph that ran with it. Cade standing in the open bay door of the shop, one hand on the frame, Nolan beside him, both of them looking not at the camera, but at something slightly to the left of it, something just outside the frame, as if they were watching the next thing approach. Neither of them was dressed for the occasion. Cade was wearing the same style of thermal shirt he always wore. Nolan had grass stains on the knee of his jeans. They looked entirely unbothered by the record of who they were. Mallory set the phone face down on the counter and stayed there for a long time. Sterling's fund opened an internal inquiry that week into the conduct of 2 senior associates connected to the unauthorized approach to Cade's former engineer. Sterling, whose name appeared in the communications that Von Mercer had documented, stepped back from his managing director role while the review was conducted. The engagement, which had already been under strain since the afternoon in the shop, did not survive the combination of the inquiry and the specific reckoning that Mallory had been conducting in the silence of the preceding days. She ended it without drama, without a public statement, and without asking anyone for an opinion. Cade received, in the 3 weeks following the article's publication, 117 formal inquiries from investment firms, 11 requests for speaking engagements, 6 offers to relocate Whittaker Dynamics' primary operations to major metropolitan markets, and 1 handwritten note from Dwight Calloway in Florida, who had sold him the shop 8 years ago, and who wrote that he always knew Cade was going to do something with the place, and that he hoped the old lift still worked. Cade responded to none of the investment inquiries directly. He worked through Vaughn on every one of them. The speaking engagements he declined for the time being. The relocation offers he set aside permanently because he had already made the decision that the first Whittaker Dynamics manufacturing facility would be built in Ashford on a parcel of county land 2 miles from the shop, and that it would be operational within 18 months, and that it would create, at full capacity, over 2,000 jobs for people from this county and the 2 adjacent to it. He told the county commissioner this in a meeting that lasted 20 minutes, and that the commissioner would reference for the rest of his public career. Mallory came back to the shop on a quiet Saturday, 2 weeks after the article, without calling first. She drove herself. No Mercedes, a simpler car she'd had before Sterling. Still reliable, still hers. She parked in the gravel lot and sat in the car for a moment before getting out. Cade was at the workbench when she knocked on the bay door frame, and he looked up and let her in without making her wait outside to wonder if she should have come. She said she had not come to revisit any conversation or to ask for anything. She said she just needed to say something to his face rather than in a message. She told him that she had spent years interpreting his quietness as passivity, his patience as defeat, his refusal to perform success as proof that he had nothing to perform. She said that she had been wrong not in an abstract way but in a specific active, daily way, that she had made choices based on that wrongness, and that those choices had cost both of them things she couldn't give back. She said she was sorry. Not for the divorce, she clarified. She thought, honestly, that the divorce had probably been the right call for reasons beyond money. She was sorry for the mockery. She was sorry for the morning she had laughed at the sign in front of Nolan. Cade listened without interrupting. He stood with his weight on one foot the way he always stood when he was paying real attention. When she was done, he said that he accepted what she had said, and that he wanted her to know that the anger he'd once carried had been finished with for a long time, not because he had decided to forgive in the strategic sense, but because he had simply stopped needing her to confirm his value. He said that there had been a period when he'd worked as hard as he had, partly because he wanted to prove something to her, and that once he'd recognized that motivation for what it was, he'd let it go. He said he built what he built because it was worth building, and because Nolan deserved a father who believed that. Those were the only reasons that had survived long enough to matter. She asked quietly whether he hated her for it. He said he didn't. He said there had been a version of himself early on who might have, but that version had been replaced by someone who didn't have the time or the interest, and he thought on the whole that was a better version. She laughed, a real one, brief and a little surprised, the kind of laugh that happens when a sentence lands somewhere unexpected. He almost smiled. They agreed, that afternoon, to be better, not as spouses or as anything the world had a name for, but as the two adults most responsible for a specific 10-year-old boy, which was sufficient and clear and required nothing more from either of them than consistency. Cade told her one condition: Nolan was never again to be made to feel that where he came from was something to explain away. Mallory said that was a promise she intended to keep. Nolan came in from the side yard where he'd been kicking a ball against the shop wall, and without being asked to, without having heard the terms of anything, he handed his mother a small die-cast truck, red, a little scuffed from where it had been dropped on the concrete, that he and Cade had repainted together the previous weekend. She held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. She understood, without anyone having to explain it to her, that what Cade had built in this place was not only a company. It was a boy who knew how to make something and give it freely. The year that followed the Forbes piece was, by most measures, the loudest year of Cade Whitaker's life, which was notable because he moved through it at more or less the same volume he had always used. Whitaker Dynamics broke ground on the Ashford facility in late spring, and the ceremony drew an attendance that the town had not seen for an event since its 150th founding anniversary. Reagan Holloway was there for the follow-up piece. Several senators' offices sent representatives. The three transportation companies whose contracts had been among the first were represented by executives who stood at the perimeter of the crowd in the way that people stand when they are aware of having been part of something before it became important. Cade spoke for 4 minutes. He did not use notes. He did not mention money, which was the thing everyone had come specifically hoping he would address, and the restraint made the speech more memorable than any figure would have. He said that the thing he hoped Ashford would take from all of this, the noise and the cameras and the number everyone had seen in the article, was not the number. He said the thing worth taking was the simpler one, that a garage is not a ceiling, that the people who look at what you're building before it's finished and see only what it's missing are not seeing wrong. Exactly, they're just seeing early. He said that patience, in his experience, was not a passive quality. It was the most aggressive thing he knew how to be. He said that the building behind him was going to put 2,000 people to work, and that he hoped a few of them, sometime in the next 10 or 20 years, would look at something they were building and decide to trust it past the point where trusting it was easy. The crowd applauded for a long time. A few people in the front rows were crying and not trying particularly hard to hide it. Whitaker Auto Works did not close. Cade had considered it briefly, in the abstract way that people consider abandoning the scaffold once the building is up. He had decided against it before the thought had fully formed. He kept the original bays, updated the lift and the diagnostic equipment, hired 3 more mechanics from the county, people he had known, in some cases, since before the divorce, and continued to take in the same kind of work the shop had always taken in. Older vehicles, working vehicles, the kind that belong to people who need them to run and don't have a lot of margin if they don't. He maintained a small number of those clients himself, personally, for no reason he bothered to articulate to anyone who asked. He started an apprenticeship program in partnership with the county vocational school, taking on 2 apprentices per year, kids who were interested in working with their hands and who had been told by various forces in their lives that working with your hands was a consolation prize. He told them, on the first day of each new cohort, that there was no such thing as a consolation prize for someone who was actually good at what they were doing. The sign above the bay door stayed. Cade had it cleaned and the letters touched up, but he didn't replace it, and he didn't add anything to it for almost 6 months after the Forbes piece ran. Then one morning Nolan came in before school and found him in the lot with a can of black paint and a small brush, and the boy sat on the hood of an old Chevy pickup and watched his father paint a single line below the original lettering. When Cade stepped back, Nolan read it aloud, built-in silence, proven in time. He sat with that for a moment. He told his father it was good. Cade said he thought so too. At the facility opening, when a reporter asked Cade how he wanted to be remembered, as a billionaire, as an engineer, or as a founder, Cade looked across the crowd and found Nolan's face, the way he always found it in any room, without effort, the way you find the thing you've been orienting around without knowing it. He looked at his son for a moment before he answered. Then he turned back to the reporter and said, before any of those things, he was a father. The reporter wrote it down. Reagan Holloway, standing 12 feet to the left, had already written it down. The morning after the ceremony, Cade opened the shop at 6:15 the same way he had opened it for 8 years, with the same key, in the same order, with the same brief pause at the threshold before stepping inside where the light was still the particular gray gold of early morning through industrial skylights, and the smell was oil and metal, and the specific silence of a place that has been worked in long enough to have a character of its own. Nolan would be dropped off at 10 for the weekend. They had the bike to finish, and a transmission job on a neighbor's pickup that had been waiting since Tuesday, and no particular hurry with any of it. Cade poured his coffee from the old carafe, stood at the workbench, and looked at the room behind the pegboard, the monitors dark now, the files archived and organized, the whiteboard wiped clean and waiting for whatever the next problem turned out to be. He thought about what he would tell Nolan when the boy was old enough to ask for the full version of the story. He thought he would tell him that the hardest thing in the life of any person who is building something true is simply staying in the room when everyone who looks in through the window sees nothing worth staying for. He thought he would tell him to stay in the room anyway. He put down his coffee and picked up a wrench, and the day began, the same as every day before it, in the only place where any of it had ever made sense.